Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 14 years of collective experience as a registered social worker and 5 years working as a therapist. In this video, I want to talk about aspects of the shared fantasy, particularly with your mother or your father, and how they get you as a source of supply and court you or get you into this shared fantasy with them. And essentially, according to Sam Vaknin, all narcissists do this in terms of creating this shared fantasy. It's part of the disorder in the sense that they are a regressed self. So they're very much, according to him, like a 2 to 3 year old. And because they're not a fully formed self and have not individuated, they're basically recreating this early childhood trauma or this regressed self in this process with you each time they're interacting with you and in the relationship generally. So you probably, when you first see your mom, your father, this is, let's say, after a few months, you maybe miss them, obviously, and let's say you're going out for coffee with them and you're sharing about how you've been over the last few months, how life is going. You're talking about aspects of your life and also probably asking about them. And you're believing that you're in this mutual, sharing, loving relationship, most likely. Perhaps you also have some trust issues or some hesitancy over the years because you probably know that your mom, your father have aspects of them that aren't healthy. And so perhaps you've already picked up on the ways in which they have a level of narcissism, or at least you've always had a sense that they have not been a healthy person. And also your intuition and your sense of them scanning you during these early stages is something you probably pick up on as well. In any healthier relationship, usually you're disclosing things about your life and you're talking about your day and things you're interested in, and you're believing that this is mutual with the person. Sharing back and forth and disclosing things about your day. But with a narcissist, even if it's your mother or father, you get the sense that they're scanning you and picking up on things. There's also this notion that you're not fully connecting with them emotionally, or you could even say it like a soul level, but rather there is this notion of cold empathy. They're likely feigning or emulating a lot of emotion. It's very confusing for you, but it's likely the case that you're a trusting individual and someone maybe that's perhaps a bit naive, thinking that your mom and your dad are mutually giving to you and actually showing care and interest in your life. But I'm going to explain to you why, if your parent is truly narcissistic, they are doing their best in these earlier stages when they haven't seen you for a while, converting you into the shared fantasy, and how they are first scanning you and then essentially baiting you into this process. According to Sam Vaknin, the first stage is that a narcissist does is they scan the room and they look for their target. And they usually do this in a place they're comfortable with, like a bar or maybe like a coffee shop, just somewhere that they are comfortable and also get narcissistic supply. So people know them there. And so there could be the sense that you haven't seen them for a few months and you're in a setting they're quite comfortable and used to. Let's say you're out in public in a coffee shop. If someone is, they usually will, a narcissist will stay around environments that they get narcissistic supply and a place that other people are giving them admiration. They also have control of these environments. If you're in a romantic relationship and you're in a bar, a narcissist is scanning the room, almost like a Terminator, right? A robot. And they're looking for a source of how they can find a mother in some sense. And I'll go into what this means in terms of them seeking after a mother. But essentially, you can understand this as them seeking out unconditional narcissistic supply. In a romantic context, they're looking for a target, and then they're going to audition you. But you can also understand this with your mother and your father, because they're your family. They've known you for many years, and in some sense, they understand the backstory. But for a narcissist, there isn't really a continuity of self. They often romanticize their past, and so they exaggerate their past. And they're also usually in the future, but not in the moment. And their past is also, I would say, fragments, and it's not really a continuity. And their memory is usually off. So in some sense, in each and every time you're interacting with a narcissist, especially if it's been over a few months, they're essentially auditioning you again. Again, they're scanning you at the earlier stages, and they're determining, is this a person who can provide aspects that can provide narcissistic supply? And what are some of these assets? So according to Sam Vaknin, there's the four S's. And so he talks about status, sex, services. And obviously with your parent, it's most likely going to be more to do with the status and services. In terms of status, are there things in your life that reflect good on them that they can use maybe to share with other friends, essentially to make them look good in front of other people, or just feel good about their own ego or their false self? Because according to Sam Vaknin, there isn't really an ego or a self there. It's more this false self. The narcissist believes that they are this false self. But in terms of services, it's, at least in a romantic context, is can they cook, they clean, can they have a car, just aspects like this that they're seeking after. So if in these first stages, they're figuring out, like they're auditioning you and they're determining, is this someone that's going to be reliable for this play or movie? I spoke in another video about how the narcissist is like the producer, director, and scriptwriter all in one. And you can understand that as a shared fantasy in the sense that they're auditioning you to determine, are you going to be an unconditional narcissistic supply for them? So in terms of them auditioning you, again, they're going back and seeing, is this person going to stick around? Are they someone that's going to be safe and reliable? And it's most likely the case because you're their son or their daughter, and you're likely, well, it's not that you're naive, but it's just that you're probably still wanting that mutual relationship with your mom and your dad, and you're under the impressions that you're just building a relationship again, getting to know each other and catching each other up on your day or your months that you've been away. And so there's a sense that you're under the impression that this is a mutual, loving, caring relationship. But I think there's a notion that we attribute ourselves or the way we are in terms of our psyche to the narcissist and other people. So we assume that other people are like us. But understanding that the narcissist really isn't like us in a lot of ways, and that they're mostly doing this impulsively, and there's this automatic compulsion for them to get you into this shared fantasy. That's what they're up to when they haven't seen you for several months. And that's why you can get this feeling, intuition, that something's off in this dynamic. They're not really connecting with you at an emotional, psychological, or spiritual level, but rather they're typically emulating and having this cold empathy, as well as scanning you for weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Because it's your mom, your dad, they probably already know some of your insecurities or weaknesses, but again, because there's not a continuity of self, it's likely the case, especially if they haven't seen you for several months, that they are doing this anew as well. And so they're your self-disclosures, that's your mom, your dad, so you think you can trust them, rely on them, and that they're not going to use any of your personal disclosures against you, then you're probably sharing very openly. But the narcissist is basically looking for the cheeks in your armor, looking where you have these insecurities that they can later exploit in the devaluation and discard phase. And according to Sam Vaknin, they're also determining, are you someone who will be open-minded or willing to engage in this shared fantasy with them? It goes back to reality, and life can be a struggle, it can be suffering, and there's always a sense that we want to escape reality. We want to find ways to not always have this burden on us. And so the narcissist is likely seeking that out in terms of determining, is this person who engages in fantasy? Is this a person who is a romantic? Is this a person who is idealistic? Just any sense that a person who will be wanting to escape reality, and they can use that to exploit you in the shared fantasy. So if they determine that's the case, then they're likely going to bait you in the next stage. And again, it depends on every context, right? In a romantic and a friendship context, it's different. But your parent is actually still doing this in this notion of the shared fantasy. And they're baiting you in the sense that, according to Sam Vaknin, they're this regressed self. They're going to show you this younger part of themselves, this younger inner child. But this is, according to him, just an emulation. It's not an actual inner child of themselves, because there is no self there, there is no inner child there. But the false self masquerades or gives the impression of this young, needing child, a child in need. And so this triggers in you maternal instincts to want to comfort this inner child of theirs. But again, this is just an emulation and really just a way to get you into this shared fantasy. But in this process, it's regressing you, and because they're also going to be going after your own inner child, it's a bit confusing because there's the notion of the dual mothership model. They want you to be a mother to this inner child, but they also want you to regress into this inner child of yourself. What you can understand is that in these early stages, the narcissist is regressing you to these younger parts. And then when the devaluation process happens, your attachment wounds and your attachment needs are being triggered. It's likely the case that you're like regressed to this younger part. And you basically, once you're devalued, you have to pull yourself up from these younger parts that you've been regressed to. But in these early stage, you're in the more idolization or romantic. Obviously, it's not your parents, it's not romantic, but they're certainly love bombing you and idolizing you. And then also, according to Sam Vaknin, they're seeking to see if you are going to comfort their inner child part. That's actually not an actual inner child, but an emulation. This is their way to get their hooks into you and regress you into these earlier parts of themselves and then also early parts of yourself. And perhaps because, again, it's your mom and your father, and you want a mutual relationship, loving, mutual, caring relationship with them, then you go along with this believing, that this is a mutual relationship. But it's not until the devaluation phase that you realize this was in some sense an illusion. And you probably look back at these times where you did notice this scanning and this cold empathy and the way you weren't fully connected with them in terms of in your heart and in your psyche as well as spiritually. Then you understand that they were at this from the very beginning in terms of getting you into the shared fantasy. I wanted to explain how narcissists in these early stages are seeking a conduit, someone they can push off to individuate. But of course, they can never really individuate, and they're basically doing their best to use you because the narcissist is not a fully formed self. They need others to individuate and reject. In the same way that a child rejects their mother at around 2 or 3 to become a fully formed ego or a fully formed self, at least the first stages of the individuation process. That's what the narcissist is doing in terms of this shared fantasy. And then once they are discarding you, that's essentially what they're doing. This process is automatic and something that is predetermined. I think a lot of us, when we're first in this experience, we come to think that it's something to do with us and we personalize it. And it's usually brought on very quick because things maybe were going very well for a few days, a few weeks with our parents. Maybe we are there for the holidays. We think the family often turns on us as the scapegoat, and they tend to blame us for things that we allegedly caused. So maybe we're in our best behavior and thinking, okay, I'm going to go home for the holidays. I'll keep it very neutral. I'm not going to engage in this drama or any form of arguments. If things get heated, I'm just going to walk away or do my best to step out and not create this situation with my family because I want there to be a good holiday. But once you realize there's this narcissistic abuse cycle and this notion of the shared fantasy, as well as the dual mothership model, you're understanding that the narcissist has to do this in some sense. It's a compulsion. It's their own regressed self and their own lack of individuation needing you, borrowing yourself, to step off of and use as a way to try to individuate. And the same way that they, in an earlier stage, likely rejected their mother and treat you as their mother in some sense, they are trying to become a separate person, but through you. In that process, you're getting regressed and it's pulling you down. They also look for reactions. If you're not playing ball and going along with this, you are in the discard phase, and then you go back into the hoovering stage, and then the process starts again. That's why it's incredibly confusing for the scapegoat. You're on your best behavior, but because you're the scapegoat, you internalize a lot of this and tend to have a lot of guilt and shame. Everyone in the family is telling you you're at fault, or you have close family friends blaming you or hearing stories about you. And so it's hard for you with all that pressure to not think that there's something you did. But once you realize that this is the way in which all narcissists operate, you understand that they're doing this to everyone. And because you have for many years been a strong force and source of narcissistic supply, then they take advantage of you in this way. But in order to get out of this is to probably just not play the process. And that's difficult, right? Because you're going to have to grieve this relationship most likely. And you could definitely try limiting contact. But if a parent is truly narcissistic, they're always going to want to be their agenda. And they're always going to be doing this process. Again, because, at least again, according to Sam Vaknin, it's a compulsion and it's automatic. It's part of the nature of the narcissist and their lack of self, which helps you understand it's not personal, but at the same time, this is your mom, your father, and it's unfortunate because you want there to be some mutuality, but it always has to be on their agenda, and they're basically doing this to you each time that you're interacting with them. So it's hard not to get sucked into this shared fantasy game with them. So in terms of the dual mothership model, this has to do with the narcissist leading it off in terms of them regressing to this younger part of themselves and then looking for your sympathy. They basically present this part of themselves to you. And it's most likely the case that they've done this throughout your life when there's been stress or any time in particular, but they have made you like parentified from a young age in the sense that you are to care for their emotional needs. And in that process, it's put you in a position where, again, you've had to mature emotionally and be there for your parents before an average child in a healthier family would be. So when you've been in that situation from a young age and you're still interacting with your mother, it's probably very natural for you to have this process work its way out over time. And if I take the example of two people in a session, if it's like a daughter and a mother, and let's say that the mom has been indicated by the daughter to be narcissistic, spending a lot of time in therapy and coming to this realization, or at least that's the way she presents it. You as a therapist are to have a session with them and to first get to know them, understand the context and understand the dynamic and the history. Obviously what's important is the family, figuring out the family of origin, who's in the family and what are the relationships and major milestones throughout life. But I'm thinking about a situation where there's a mom and a daughter, and then there might be other siblings, a stepfather or a biological father, but they're separated. This daughter has a stepfather and other siblings. And there could be favoritism and certain relationships independent from the daughter and mother's relationship. There's a lot of bad blood, yet this daughter wants to have some form of relationship with her mom. In the book Narcissistic Families, they talk about going back to the well, but the well keeps making you sick, and yet you keep going back thinking that you get fresh water, but it makes you sick each time. It's interesting because if you take narcissism as a spectrum, then perhaps you have a mother who has narcissistic tendencies, but then maybe doesn't have full NPD. And that's the tricky thing about this situation is that, what to say, as a therapist and YouTube educator, I don't want to promote the breaking of families or label people that aren't actually narcissistic. That word's thrown around a lot, so I'm careful to use that terminology. I definitely think it's overused in the online space or just in the community. It does a lot of good though, because you have to define narcissism and it gives a lot of insights to the situation. What Sam Vaknin talks about is a heuristic principle, something that makes sense of people's behavior, especially as our society is becoming more narcissistic. If you think of narcissism existing on a spectrum, then you might have narcissistic style in a parent or narcissistic. But at the end of the day, if someone's toxic for you and it's not a good relationship, then it is best to leave that dynamic, regardless of the label and regardless if you ever get a diagnosis. And usually you don't, right? Especially if the parent is covert. And although I guess latest research is saying that covert narcissists typically go to therapists more, so perhaps there's the likelihood of being diagnosed, but they're usually more covert with their presentation, so it's possibly trickier to assess and pick up on. But back to the point of these two daughters, right? So you see this in the session where both escalate and there's a lot of bad blood mentioned, and there's usually some grievance. When I'm working with couples, you want to speak to some of the challenge and some of the issues, but you obviously don't want the session them to associate, therapy with conflict, or for them to get into their fight or flight. when you get into your fight or flight response, your adrenaline's going and you're not taking a lot of information in, right? There's something to be said about when people express anger and they're upset and they say certain things that usually speak to the truth, and yet at the same time they're getting dysregulated and the communication's getting lost. And so you notice that in a couple session, it's two boats passing in the night and there's no real contact, right? And yet sometimes you do need to see and observe those situations and allow it just to understand the dynamic, because it is typically the way that it unfolds naturally. And so in a therapeutic setting, you're just observing likely what is occurring on a regular basis. In some ways it's helpful, and you also pay attention to the body language and just the way that they're responding in the moment. Do they touch their face? Is their face getting red? Do they look away? These kind of things, right? And obviously it's different when you're with a couple versus a family. But with regards to this example of a daughter and a mom, you will see, at least in the situation I'm thinking about, the mom seemingly presents a sense that she's hard done by and looking for sympathy to some degree, either from myself as a therapist, but also from the daughter. That's usually a tell, right? If this notion of the dual mothership model. So they're like perhaps presenting like their false self is this young part of the self and presenting this needing child. Because a daughter throughout the years, and if they've been parentified, this is common for them to be present for their mom in that regard. In these situations where it's been many years and they've done their own therapy and their own inner work, they have grieved that role and can present as being shut down and having their heart not open. I only hear from them and what they're telling me in terms of their history and some of the dynamic. And it certainly can be the case that the daughter, what to say, has closed her heart and is really not hopeful. There's a lot of dynamics going on. But I understand how the narcissist, if someone's truly a narcissist, will lead with this needing child. In that process, the daughter will get parentified and step into comfort and be there for their mother, but in a childlike part of themselves. This isn't an actual child. It is more part of the false self. So it's an emulation of a child, not to be confused with the inner child. According to him, the narcissist doesn't have an inner child. And so this is just the false self showing one of its many faces. Typically, my understanding is that the narcissist is at like 2 or 3 age level in terms of their development. So they're at this regressed state. And so there is some correlation and some, common patterns with the way they present this needing child, but there's no sense that they have an inner child. I think we can understand the mom in this situation presenting this young part of herself, but it's not an actual child self. It's just a false self masquerading as child self. And daughter is typically used to maybe being parentified and stepping in to comfort that child part of the mom self. And that's the part in which the shared fantasy operates. You notice it in sessions where it's almost like they're parenting each other, but obviously there's the mom who's in the hierarchy, if we take family constellations, is to be at the head of the household and at least have some authority as the mom over the daughter, regardless of them being an adult. They might lack either emotional immaturity or have narcissism. And if they do have narcissism, it's going back to this dual mothership model where both of them are acting like mothers to each other and both are regressing to a younger part of themselves. But the narcissist is doing this within the shared fantasy. The healthier daughter, more empathetic and more in touch with reality testing, is being regressed in that process. It's a question, is there any hope for a daughter and a mom like this? It's too early to tell with the situation I'm thinking about. You always want to hope that people can communicate in a session and pay attention to these patterns. I think, though, you always got to put your biases at the door and consider observing each person, not going off just what, in this situation, the daughter says that mom has narcissism. But certainly, the one I'm thinking about the situation, their mom does present as emotionally immature at times and does look for sympathy or is the sense that she's hard done by. And then is speaking to aspects where she feels like she's trying to communicate with her daughter, but it doesn't touch and it doesn't land with her. But again, the daughter in this situation is resentful or angry at her mother for the many years where she wasn't present. And so a lot of her words are empty. A child that is considered probably more the scapegoat, at least what I've noticed in sessions, is that for the first session, they just need to vent and they feel heard. And I feel, at least within the first session, especially for myself as a therapist, because the scapegoat often doesn't feel heard or they hold on to a lot, It's just sometimes needed to hold space for that and for it not to be judged at all. But also paying attention to the pattern and how your mom and the daughter are showing up. Family dynamics are complex. There could be a host of situations going on, but certainly, at least in the situation I'm thinking about, the dual mothership model, that could be an example where the mom is presenting this young part that is this pseudo child that is acting in need and desperately in need. And then the paternal instincts of all of us want to comfort that young part. But of course, that's inappropriate for a healthy relationship. Really, a mom shouldn't be turning towards their daughter or their son, or if it's a father, for that need. That is what's unhealthy in the dynamic, right? Whether that can be changed is one situation. If mom's truly a narcissist and there's this dual mothership and shared fantasy going on, then those are deeper psychic and they're core at the personality, and the personality is disorganized. But a lot of my clients, it's like your daughter, so it's your mom or your dad. A lot of people, my clients will say, I just want one last effort, one more effort. And then it's I'm cautious to have them be exposed to further trauma if that's what's going to happen, because often the mom in the situation or the dad, likely, if they're truly narcissistic, will invalidate the daughter. But you want to give people the space and the benefit of the doubt and at least provide some therapeutic guides so that you can help at least this relationship if there is a way in which it can be mended. A lot of that comes down to truth, but a lot of times in any argument, you get caught in the weeds. You also notice the four horsemen in this situation. There's criticism from the daughter and defensiveness from the mom. Then the mom will strike back with her own criticisms, and the cycle will continue. If we take Gottman's theory, he would say that's going to erode the friendship. Obviously, it's not the same necessarily with a family per se, but you can understand that it's going to erode the trust of the relationship when there is very little trust. But two are showing up and willing to hear each other. And I think the therapist is paying attention to deeper aspects in terms of the dual mothership model, that there can be at least some benefit for them to speak, with the caveat that mom isn't further exposing the daughter to this shared fantasy and dual mothership aspect, and also excessive criticism. And but often any daughter or son, they tend to want to at least try one aspect, and if the parent is saying that they're open to therapy, then it's worth the chance to try. My focus is on narcissism, abuse, and scapegoating, particularly within the family dynamic. That's one lens and one approach. Humans are complex. But the thing is, at the same time, you don't want to discount, because typically a scapegoat, right, or someone who's in a position where they've had the family against them and been invalidated for many years, it's easy for them to get back into the narcissistic abuse cycle occurring. And so that can actually be more harmful in the long run if they're continuously exposed to that. But at the same time, a lot of them obviously want to try one last time, or at least try any effort they can to try to mend that relationship. So if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.